I stood still in the dim light as my greedy husband demanded that I sell my $4 million inheritance. His voice, icy and merciless, cut through the tension. He snarled, his eyes narrowing in frustration that quickly turned to anger. "You have no choice, Rachel." Before I could respond, he grabbed a wooden stick off the wall and struck me hard in the head. I immediately fainted. My arms and legs were securely bound with rudimentary ropes and hanging from a tree when I woke up. The pressure on my expanding stomach was so intense that every breath felt like an uphill battle. Ethan was standing nearby, watching me fight and waiting for me to give up as he smiled cruelly. "I'm 30 years old, and my name is Rachel. In Atlanta, Georgia, I work as a graphic designer for a startup advertising company. A year ago, I was married to Ethan, a 28-year-old businessman who appeared like the perfect wife. He was charming, aspirational, and supportive. He spoke of building a great future with me and celebrated every professional accomplishment I achieved. Everything changed when I received the enormous property worth $4 million that belonged to my late grandfather. The property has been in my family for many years, and I always thought of it as a legacy for my future children. Ethan initially seemed happy for praising my family for their achievements and discussing how we might continue valuing. However, he soon became enthralled with the property. He first mentioned it casually in conversations. "Just think of what we could do." He once said, "We could do so much with the money from selling it." I believed he was just sharing ideas, so I brushed his comments aside. But his tone changed with time. He pushed that we sell the land and no longer respected my independence. He offered it as a way to safeguard the goals of our family. But there was something strange about his resolve. His goals were not as noble as he claimed, and I began to have my doubts. Despite my growing agony, I refused to back down. The property was more than just land to me. It was a part of my past and a symbol of my family's perseverance and diligence. I couldn't let go of something so important no matter how hard Ethan pushed me. What started as a light conversation developed into disagreements that caused me to question whether my husband, the kind, supportive husband I thought I knew, was showing a new side of himself. This feature will soon turn my life into a nightmare. Ethan's obsession with the property was becoming more and more apparent every day. What started as helpful suggestions became firm demands. He began bringing up the topic whenever he could, arguing that it was the right thing to do. "Many problems would be resolved if you sold the property, Rachel. It's a wise choice," he would respond impatiently. I held my ground. "Ethan, I've already explained that real estate is about more than just making money. Since it's a part of my family's heritage, I won't sell it." His irritation started to impact other facets of our relationship. The once loving man who had complimented my freedom abruptly stopped respecting my choices. He would say that I didn't care about our future and accuse me of being selfish. It seemed as though the man I married was disappearing, to be replaced with a cold, crafty individual. It was during supper one evening that he lost control. As we sat at the meal, he mentioned the property once more. "It would be irresponsible to leave it lying there unused," he said firmly, swirling his glass of wine. "We need to sell it, Rachel." I set down my fork and looked straight at him. "No, Ethan, we have discussed this. I won't sell it." His jaw tightened and his voice became piercing. "You're behaving illogically. Our family is affected by this. How come you can't see that?" With composure, I stated, "This isn't just about us. That property belongs to our child's future. I can't let you take that away." When his face became hazy and he slammed his hand against the table, I recoiled. "You think that you can make all the decisions, don't you? Do you even want to date me?" "I do care, Ethan, but I won't be forced to do this." He sprang to his feet, his chair scraping the floor. "You'll regret this," he spat angrily and rushed out of the room. For the first time, I felt a chill of fear in my chest. My reliable man was no longer the friend I thought him to be. Something dangerous was simmering beneath the surface. Our level of tension continued to increase over the next few days. As Ethan grew colder and more distant, his once subtle manipulation turned into overt hostility. As though every conversation kept coming back to the property, his tone became more aggressive with each rejection. One night, everything came to a head. When Ethan got home late, he was already feeling irritated. I sat in the living room hoping to avoid another argument, but it was inevitable. He said sharply as he stood in the doorway, "We need to talk." I groaned and braced myself. "Again, Ethan, if it's about the property." "It is," he cut in with a stern, uncompromising tone, and I finished begging nicely. "They're planning to sell it." "No," I firmly said, not going to back down. "I told you, Ethan, the property is not for sale. I will not repeat it." His face twisted in anger, and he yelled across the room, his hands clenched at his sides. "Do you think you can ignore me? Do you think you are the object of this?" His voice rose with each word, his anger unrestrained. "Ethan, relax." I took a step back and pleaded, "This isn't the way." Before I could say anything further, he took up a wooden stick that was leaning against the wall. Anger blazing in his eyes, he lifted it high. He screamed, "You'll learn to listen." The blow hit my head with such force that it sent a ripple of pain through my skull. My eyesight blurred and I stumbled backward before falling to the ground. Everything went black around me. When I woke up, everything was different. My limbs and legs were tied tightly with coarse ropes while I hung from a tree. The rough fibers sank into my body as the weight pressed firmly on my expanding belly. Ethan was standing nearby, watching me with a sly grin, and I was frightened. He mockingly questioned, "Are you ready to sell the property now, or do you need more convincing?" Despite my fear, I knew I needed to be strong. For me, for my child. The rough fibers of the ropes sliced into my wrists and ankles, burning my skin every time I moved. My body hung awkwardly from the tree, the weight pressing cruelly on my pregnant belly. I gulped for oxygen as Ethan got close, my heart racing with terror. "Do you still think you're in charge, Rachel?" He grinned as he leaned against the tree trunk. "There are two options available to you. Choose whether to sell the property or hold on to it until you make a different decision." His remarks drove deeper and deeper holes in my chest with each one. I fought the need to cry because I knew it would only make him feel more wickedly gratified. "Ethan, please," I begged in a trembling voice. "Think about our kid. This is not expected." His expression contorted with rage and contempt. He approached nearer. "Our baby." He spat. "Don't try to make me feel bad, Rachel. You were the one who made me do this. Right now, you could halt it all. Simply sell the property." His disregard for my pain was appalling, yet I was unable to show him how terrified I was. Looking at the ropes that shackled my wrists, I realized that the knot was not as tight as it looked. There was a flicker of hope, but I had to be careful. Any sudden action could catch his attention. As Ethan turned away, muttering to himself about my persistence, I began to twist my wrists. The ropes scraped my skin, but I clenched my teeth and kept working. Every stride I took brought me one step closer to freedom. "Don't even think about trying anything." Ethan snapped his back to us. My heart was pounding, but I went on. With a final desperate tug, my hands broke free, and the knot slightly relaxed. I fell to the ground and quickly undid the chains that were fastened to my ankles. Ethan turned as I dashed into the darkness of the trees. I could hear his angry shouts behind me, but I didn't turn around. Today, the only thing that mattered to my child and me was survival. My face stung from the cold night air as I ran through the dense forest. Branches are scratching at my arms and legs. My pulse raced like a drum, but excitement drove me forward despite the anguish coursing through my body. Behind me, Ethan's angry shouts grew louder. "Rachel, you can't get away from me," he screamed, his voice full of rage. I was afraid to look back. I simply focused on avoiding you as much as possible. I kept moving into the woods despite the darkness and the uneven footing, which made it seem like I might trip at every step. Every time I stumbled, my pregnant belly hurt, but I persisted. My life and the life of my child rested on getting out. As his footsteps drew closer, Ethan's words rang out through the night like a predator's snarl. "You think that you're smart? You'll be sorry, Rachel." I ducked behind a large tree and knelt to catch my breath. I pressed my shaking hands to the rough bark, praying Ethan wouldn't find me. I heard him shouting curses and slowing his speed as he sought. With my heart hammering in my ears, I found it difficult to remain silent. I exploited the fact that his footsteps were becoming more distant. I ran again, toward what I believed to be the wood's edge. Even though my legs hurt and I was tired, a faint glow in the distance gave me hope. It was a road. Pushing through the last tangle of branches, I stumbled onto the road. In the distance, headlights appeared. I moved into the car's path and wildly waved my arms. The automobile screeched to a stop and the driver, a kind old man, sprang out. "Are you okay?" he asked, with a worried expression on his face. I gasped, tears streaming down my face. My husband. He tried to kill me. The man didn't hesitate. He helped me into his car and then sped off to the nearest police station. For the first time in hours, I felt a little safer, but I knew the agony was far from over. Ethan had to be given justice. There was a quiet intensity to the hum of the police station as I sat in a small cubicle, trembling and clutching a blanket someone had placed over my shoulders. The cops listened intently as I told them about the argument, Ethan's vicious assault, and my desperate run into the woods. Every phrase was like reliving the nightmare, but I knew I had to remain strong. I said, my voice shaking, my husband tied me to a tree. He beat me when I refused to sell the land, despite his threats. He didn't care about our baby. My hands trembled as I described the savagery. The officer sitting across from me nodded solemnly, his pen moving across a notepad. Ma'am, we'll handle it from here. You're safe now. Let's get you to a doctor to ensure you and your child are doing well. Henry, the nice man who had saved me, stayed long enough to say anything. He reported her fear to the authorities. That kind of fear, bruised, wounded, and desperate, cannot be faked. I was examined in detail by the hospital's doctors. My baby was found to be unharmed despite my minor concussion and serious bruises. I was relieved by their assurances, but thinking about what Ethan had done still made me feel nauseous. At the police station, the investigation moved swiftly forward. The authorities collected evidence from our home, photos of the tree where I was hanging, the wooden stick Ethan used, and the cords he tied me with. Henry's testimony in my wounds painted a terrible picture. Ethan was hauled into arrest the next morning. He insisted on his innocence to portray himself as the victim, but his deception was quickly discovered. When my father traveled from New York to assist me, I was energized. Ethan had tried to take away my freedom, my prospects, and my child's safety. I would ensure that he was held responsible for his wrongdoings. Justice was no longer a hope, but a promise. On the day of the trial, I stood at the courtroom entrance with my heart pounding in my chest. Ethan's previously confident posture was replaced by a nervous strain as he sat at the defendant's table. His eyes darted to me as I entered, but I couldn't take my eyes off of him. With my hands shaking in my lap, I sat down on the witness stand. The prosecutor, a lady named Thompson, stood to my left in a determined and assertive manner. She addressed the court with the clarity of someone who has seen far too many victims of abuse. Mrs. Williams looked over my shoulder. Please tell the court what happened on the night of the attack. Despite the surge of emotions that threatened to overwhelm me, I took a deep breath and spoke in a firm tone. Ethan got obsessed with selling the property I inherited from my grandfather. When I refused, he became more aggressive. That night, he hit me with a wooden stick and tied me up. He vowed to make me regret not selling the land after he had hung me from a tree. Everyone was affected by what I said, and the room became quiet. I paused, staring down at my hands and fighting back tears. Why wouldn't you sell the property? What? Ms. Thompson asked. I lifted my head to meet her gaze. It was not just land. It was my family's legacy. It was meant for my child. I wouldn't let him wreck it for his own good. The evidence was obvious, but Ethan's lawyer tried to undermine me by saying I was too sentimental. Everything I had told them, including the images of the tree, the knots in the ropes, and the bruises on my arms, was confirmed by the police and Henry's evidence. Hours of deliberation preceded the jury's final decision. Gasping for air, I sat in the courtroom until a door opened and the verdict was read. I feel bad. It was no longer heavy in my chest. Justice was served. I would no longer be under Ethan's influence. The courtroom became silent as the judge lifted his gavel. The defendant, Ethan Williams, is hereby sentenced to 23 years in jail. Early parole is not available for violent crimes, attempted coercion, or reckless endangerment. Unaware that I had been holding back a breath, I let it out. Finally, the seriousness of the situation became apparent. In addition to the pain he caused, Ethan was punished for all the time he had stolen from me. The control, the fear, the manipulation. Ethan's once confident face descended into a mix of shock and anger as the announcement was made. His lawyer tried to argue for a lighter sentence, but the court was unyielding. The court continued by saying, "Your behavior was extremely cruel. You'll be responsible for what you do." I sat motionless, finding it difficult to understand what was being said. This was it. And the horror was over. My mind reviewed the events that had led up to this point. I was frightened when Ethan attacked me and suggested selling the farm immediately. Nevertheless, I could finally breathe. At the end of the court hearing, my father walked up to me. He embraced me tightly and spoke with great intensity. "You did it, Rachel. You stayed strong. He won't hurt you ever again." I nodded, tears in my eyes. "I couldn't have done it without you, Dad." Outside the courthouse, the weight on my shoulders was finally lifted. The sun seemed brighter and the environment quieter. I could finally enjoy the life I had fought so hard to attain now that Ethan was behind bars. In terms of getting over the trauma, starting again, and preparing for my child, I still had a long way to go, but I was determined not to let fear control me ever again. I was free. The months that followed were a blur of adjustments and new beginnings. Following the trial, I returned to my job as a graphic designer. My coworkers were supportive, so even though my memories of what I had experienced were fresh, I focused on my work. The regularity was comforting. I gave my life, and the life I hoped to construct in the future, a lot of thought. Ethan's threats and violence had no power over me any. The house where we used to sit felt far and empty, and I knew I couldn't return. I had been itching to leave what had become a prison. Power became symbolized by the property I inherited. What Iathan had considered a source of conflict was now a sanctuary. On the site, I began small projects I had always wanted to do, such as a tiny office, gardens, and a cottage that would eventually become a haven for my child. In those quiet moments when I was tilling the soil, I thought about my future and the future of my daughter. This time, I imagined my life would be different, full of love, growth, and safety, everything I had ever hoped for. I couldn't have that taken away from me. On the day my baby was born, I realized how far I had come. When I held my newborn daughter in my arms, I knew that I had survived all that had happened to me. I had overcome the gloom and fought for my future. I persisted because I knew my child would never comprehend the terror I had experienced. When I first became a mother, I pledged I would stop at nothing to protect this life and this family.